In this episode 14 of the Jen Curtis podcast, I want to talk about intuitive eating and specifically why it doesn't work. And when I say it doesn't work, I'm talking about specifically for fat loss. Now, this is one of those topics that it's a bit like the body positivity topic. I made a podcast on that as well. And these two things are kind of interlinked in quite a big way. But it's one of those topics that I find that a lot of people, I have quite controversial opinions about this topic, and it doesn't sort of line up with, what most people say about intuitive eating or most coaches say about it and what's fashionable to say about it. I think my opinions are considered to be quite controversial, and I do find that I get quite a bit of backlash when I talk about these topics. But it's usually just one or two quite loud, recreationally outraged people. Whereas the vast majority of feedback that I get is like, oh, wow, that's really interesting. That makes a lot of sense. I hadn't thought about it like that. And people sort of agreeing and saying that they had thought they felt a lot of these things themselves but didn't know how to put it into words. It's also a really, really, really big topic, and I feel like I might do future podcasts on this topic, but for now I kind of want to just get some of my thoughts down on some of the major reasons why intuitive eating is not good for fat loss and usually does not work. Now, I'm going to re-emphasize the point about not being good for fat loss, and that's what I'm going to focus on here. It can be, I think that I want to just say right from the outset that I have actually read the book almost in its entirety. I got a little bit tired of it towards the end and didn't manage to finish it, but I listened to a large amount of it. I spent many hours listening to it. And I honestly, like, there are some really good things in the book, and there are things that I actually jotted down and things I took note of and thought that they were really useful tools or insights that I could take away and use with my clients. But at the same time, there were points where I literally shouted at my phone. I only listen to audiobooks. I don't actually read anything. There were times when I actually shouted at my phone, like, no, 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 just like so annoyed by what they were saying. So it was a thought-provoking book, but it also made me disagree with it a lot of the time. And I'm going to talk about those reasons, the things that I disagree with in this podcast episode. Okay, so the first reason why I disagree with the tenets and the claims of intuitive eating is because it doesn't factor into account that we live today in 2023, we live in an extremely obesogenic environment. And obesogenic means like a fattening environment. We live in a world where we have an enormous abundance of food, and we have so much food that is extremely calorie dense and extremely palatable. This is the reality that we live in today. And this has only been the reality for an extremely short period of our history as humans. So even just 100 years ago, in 1923, we lived in a completely different food environment where there was a lot of scarcity. There were a lot of rations. It was quite hard to get the calories that you needed and even harder to get the nutrients that you needed. And, even my mother-in-law talks about, like, when she was a kid, going to the shops and buying a can of condensed milk with her friends and like sipping condensed milk because it was like really, really sweet. Like, they didn't have all of the abundance of sweets and fun stuff that we have today. And kids would literally eat sugar or condensed milk because it was such a treat for them. This is how little, food was actually available. But not just that we live in an obesogenic environment today, and that most of human history, we've struggled to get the calories that we need. But also, we are wired like in a very deep biological way, to eat more calories than we need. So because we've grown, because we've always existed in a very, very scarce food environment, it's been an important adaptation in terms of our evolution, to ensure that we are wired to eat more food than we need when we get the chance. So, you know, we can, I just talked about 100 years ago, but for the vast majority of human history, we had a kind of hunter-gatherer sort of setup where we would have to hunt for meat and forage for berries. And, you know, when you might go for days and days and days without anyone succeeding in killing an animal. And then when someone brings, you know, a deer or whatever home for you to eat, you will eat as much as you possibly can until you feel sick, until you get a proper like food coma. And then you'll go into rest and digest, because there's no way of there's no way of preserving the food that's in front of you. Other people are also going to be trying to eat as much as they possibly can, and you don't know when the next kill will be. So you are wired to eat as much as you possibly can in that scenario. And something that I've pointed out in the past is that even if you're completely stuffed on protein, right, you've eaten as much deer meat as you can possibly eat, and you can't possibly put another mouthful in your mouth. If somebody then comes home with like a shit ton of berries, that is a different food source, and it's sweet and it has carbohydrates and nutrients in it that the protein doesn't have and the animal meat doesn't have. So you will still be able to eat berries, even though you can't possibly manage another morsel of deer meat. And this, we kind of see this happen, like when people joke that like you have a second stomach for dessert. It's because even when you've eaten as much savory food as you can, you're still wired to be able to eat something sweet because it will deliver different nutrients. Now, in today's obesogenic environment where you've just eaten a really fattening meal that's got way too much fat and way too many calories in it for you, you're going to have your next meal in a few hours and you're not going to run out of food. And the food the sweet food that's being presented to you is not berries. It's like chocolate cake or something. This is a bit maladaptive now in our modern food environment, but it was a really, really, really important adaptation in our hunter-gatherer history to do this, and humans who did this and who had this adaptation would survive more than the ones who weren't wired to overeat. So that combination of the obesogenic environment that we live in, plus being wired to eat more calories, this is something that intuitive eating does not take into account. Intuitive eating makes the case, the whole book makes the case that like if you just follow your intuitions, you will be around food. If you just zoom in and listen to your internal wisdom about food and what your body knows and what your body needs, you will be a healthy weight and you won't overeat. But it's not taken into account that we have adapted for a certain food environment. We've adapted for scarcity. We've adapted for having to hunt and gather our food, which has an enormous calorie expenditure, and to eat minimally processed foods or completely unprocessed foods. There's also hard to digest, that also drives up calorie expenditure from digestion. We've adapted for a particular food environment, and now in the short space of like a few hundred years, we have which is a blip in terms of like our whole evolutionary past as humans. It's just a blip in our history. In just a few hundred years, we have a completely different food environment, and our intuitions and our instincts around food and the adaptions that we have around food are not conducive to the environment that we have. In the environment that we have, they cause us to overeat. they cause us to eat. So in any environment, they cause us to eat more than we need, and they cause us to eat calorie dense foods, to prioritize calorie dense foods. You're going to prioritize fatty meat over, plants in a natural food environment for humans. But that instinct that drives you to eat more calorie dense foods and more of it than what you need causes us in the modern food environment to gain weight and to carry excess adipose tissue far beyond what we need, and to the point where it starts to disrupt our bodily functions and the proper working of our physiology. So in the traditional food environment for humans, you just, like, your instincts would have led you to be a healthy body weight, because you probably would have always been malnourished and underfed. And so when you get the opportunity to eating as much as you possibly can would have helped you survive and just stay above starvation most of the time and malnutrition. Whereas in the modern food environment, it causes you to be 30-40% body fat or more, and it really becomes quite unhealthy. But intuitive eating really pushes this narrative that it's all about listening to your body and listening to your intuitions, and that your body knows best, and that you will somehow eat the right number of calories for you and the right types of food for you in this modern food environment. And it doesn't take into account how our food environment has changed so drastically in such a short period of time, and we haven't adapted to it in terms of evolution. So my second reason that's kind of really woven into the fabric of the first is that intuitive eating, the whole concept of intuitive eating relies really, really, really heavily on this kind of appeal to nature fallacy, that like if you, that you have this internal wisdom, that your body knows intuitively and instinctively what you need, and your body is wise, and you just need to tune into your body and let her decide. This is a really, really, really popular narrative today, that the reason why you're messed up, the reason why you're overweight, the reason why you eat too much, the reason why you have psychological problems, you're depressed, whatever, is because of culture. And if we can just go back to our roots and just, that nature is perfect. Again, this appeal to nature fallacy, that everything in nature is good and will lead to your well-being, and is better than anything that's man-made. This fallacy, this kind of narrative is very, 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 very popular today. And I think it leads us astray in so many ways. Again, your natural tendency, your instinct around food is to eat as much as you possibly can and to eat calorie dense foods as much as possible. That is how that is how humans have evolved, and that is a natural and good adaptation. But it leads us astray today. So this appeal to nature fallacy, it makes people rely more on their like caveman instincts, when that's precisely not what you need, right? Your caveman instincts will lead you to eat as much ice cream and chocolate and like fattening foods and as much food as you can get your hands on. That is okay. And if you took a caveman out of like, 1,000,000 years ago and put him in today's environment, he would get fat so quick, right? Because we are wired to do as little physical activity as we possibly can and eat as much as we can. So first of all, setting up that appeal to nature fallacy, it leads people astray. It makes people think that their internal desires or instincts around food are what they should really listen to, and that they are going to find health and weight management and all of that in that. And it's really just about peeling away the layers of culture and social influence, and then what you're going to find underneath is really pure, and it's going to be really, really what you need, and it's going to be harmonious with nature and with yourself, and it's going to magically lead you to be the picture of health and the right weight and all of that stuff. And again, like I said, very popular narrative today, but I think it's a real fallacy. It's a real logical fallacy. It's not true. It doesn't apply. And actually, what we have in front of us is a modern problem. And what we need are modern solutions, like just tuning into your body and your needs and what your body wants isn't going to work in this particular scenario. And often this is the narrative that I've worked with a lot of people who have sort of really imbibed that intuitive eating kind of theme. And that way of thinking that, okay, it leads them down the wrong path, that like if they crave a certain food, they have to listen to that. They have to give that credit because your body's telling you what you need. And so they'll overeat on things that they don't need and that are causing to be overweight. And then they feel that the solution is more of the same medicine, is more intuition, more of listening to your body, more of like not listening to external things like, I don't know, calories or nutritional information about food. And it's actually just getting them into more and more trouble. It's just being prescribed the same medicine, more of the same medicine. If it's not working, they just need it in higher doses, and it's what's actually causing the problems in the first place. So my third reason for disagreeing with intuitive eating and finding it unhelpful for fat loss is that it sets up a false dichotomy. It actually sets up a lot of false dichotomies. But one of the main false dichotomy that it sets up is that there is you have a choice in front of you between kind of toxic diet culture or intuitive eating. So in order to one of the things they go through in like the main principles like at length is that you need to reject all diet culture. You need to reject everything, about every diet book you've ever read, every sort of like magic protocol, every and you need to fully embrace this approach of intuitive eating, of listening to your body, of tuning into what you need. And on the one hand, I agree that like there is this kind of toxic diet culture, right? That is filled with like specific protocols. So, for example, keto, where you cut out all carbohydrates, you eat a very high fat, low carbohydrate diet. Or for example, I don't know, intermittent fasting, where, the elixir of life is all about only eating in a certain calorie window. There are all sorts of like books and diets. I don't know. I think like the Glucose Goddess recently has certain food combinations, and cutting out certain foods is going to lead to health, or like doing and weight loss, doing a really strict detox or juice cleanse, like all of these things, like or even like the 500 calorie diet of like the 1990s, like the Victoria Beckham diet and things like that, size 0 diet. Like all of these things, I fully agree that these can all be put in a category of like toxic diet culture. It's just really icky and gross and doesn't work and is really strict protocols and does more harm than good. I absolutely agree with that. But when I say they set up a false dichotomy is they present this kind of really icky diet culture, and the only other alternative is intuitive eating. Right? It's just, there's two options. You have to pick one or the other. And it also lumps any attempt at weight loss or any external facts or nutritional information about food into that toxic diet culture. And my personal and professional opinion is that there is something in between these two extremes, that these are the two extremes. I absolutely agree that these two extremes of eating they exist, but where I differ is that I don't think they are the only options, and I think they are the extremes of a spectrum of eating. And at the end of this podcast, I'm going to talk a little bit about what I think is necessary instead. But ultimately, I think that a combination of like, absolutely listen to your body, listen to your hunger and fullness signals. Absolutely, that is part of the solution, but it's not the be all and end all. It's not the only thing. You can also combine that with cold hard facts and knowledge about food, like calories, like the calorie content of food, like how filling food makes it is, like the nutritional content of food, like the macronutrient breakdown of food. These things are also healthy. Sorry, these things are also necessary to understand in order to be healthy and in order to be a healthy body weight. And it isn't an either or. It's not either listen to your body or count calories, right? They can go together. And intuitive eating really sets up a dichotomy that it's either or, that you can't have both, that you're either listening to your body or you're tracking calories or whatever, and that is all lumped together. That every attempt at fat loss is lumped together in toxic diet culture, and any external cues is lumped together with toxic diet culture. And I disagree with that. I think there are facts that are not internal cues coming from your body or your mind, but facts about food like calories and protein content and how filling foods make you, that are also necessary to understand and that can be part of a sensible attempt at fat loss, rather than just these really icky protocols and these attempts to lose to follow these really strict protocols that are really kind of like harmful and detrimental and don't work and don't take your individuality into account. So I said that they set up quite a lot of false dichotomies. So one is that either it's toxic diet culture or intuitive eating, that there's nothing else. And the other false dichotomy that they set up is that you either listen to your body or you overly restrict yourself. So something that I hear quite a lot from intuitive eating types is that, like, oh, if you try to count calories, let's say your budget is 1,500 calories a day, and then you get to the evening and you've already eaten all your calories, but you're still hungry, then what you're going to do is not eat because you've used all your calories, and you're going to override your hunger signals. And this is, again, a really, really, really disingenuous way of illustrating how calorie counting works. This isn't how calorie counting works. If you get to the end of the day and you've already used up all your calories, you need to look at why you've used them up. You may need to look at eating more filling foods and spreading your calories out more during the day. You absolutely may need to eat and go over your calories today so that you don't go to bed hungry. But you also need to glean lessons of, like, okay, why do I need more calories than this in order to be okay, and try and figure out how to get more fullness from your food, and so on and so forth. And again, in my coaching, I use both. I get people to listen to their body and listen to their hunger and fullness signals. That's a really big part of what we do. But also to look at external things, like external objective things, like how many calories they're consuming. Right? You can do both. It doesn't have to be one or the other. And there is a false dichotomy between listening to your body or overly restricting yourself, right? It's not one or the other, because my problem is that if you give people the option, either listen to your body or restrict yourself way too much with food and feel restricted all the time and feel deprived all the time. Now, obviously, people are going to choose to listen to their body and to respect their hunger cues and to respect their cravings and to eat what they want. It's a much, much, much more appealing option and a much more appealing narrative. But these aren't the only two options, right? There's a lot. These are two extremes, and there's a lot to discover in between. And again, your fat loss efforts can combine both. You can also listen to your body and pay attention to how many calories you're eating or how much you need to be eating in order to be losing weight. And and also you may need to restrict yourself sometimes. Sometimes you may not be able to eat what you want. It's sort of intuitive eating gives people the impression that you should be able to eat exactly what you want and lose weight. And they're not always compatible. Like, you do sometimes need to say, okay, like, even though I'm craving this, even though I want this, like, I'm not going to have it because it doesn't fit in with my overall goals. So my fourth problem with it is that it doesn't take into account the fact that often our intuitions, our cravings, and our habits around food are completely out of whack. They're completely unnatural, and they are completely, driven by the wrong thing. So just to give you a couple of examples and more extreme examples, I've worked with quite a lot of people who are that fit into an obese or morbidly obese category. And often they have a lifetime of habits that feel completely normal and acceptable to them. And often many people around them have the same habits that validates what they do, but they are not healthy habits, and they're not normal in terms of like what humans do across cultures and across history. So an example would be, a lot of Americans now, like, I can't remember the exact numbers, but it's something like half of the population is obese or morbidly obese. And the eating habits that lead to being obese often involve eating extremely calorie dense and highly palatable food and ultra processed food. That's those three things combined together, just constantly throughout the day. I've worked with a lot of Americans who just constantly snack all day long. From the moment they wake up, they're just grazing on like chips, on crisps, on chocolate, on ice cream, on like food that's like that has those three kind of traits. They're ultra palatable, they're ultra processed, and they're very, 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 very calorie dense, and they're also very nutrient poor. And this has become a norm for them. And they're often consuming thousands and thousands and thousands of calories a day, more than they need. And this is what is causing them to stay the weight that they are, because they're just consuming more calories than they need to maintain their weight. But for them, this has become very intuitive. This feels very natural. And something that intuitive eating doesn't do is it doesn't come along and say it gives credence to these habits. It says, yeah, this is like, you need to listen to your body, and people's habits are often so out of whack with what they really need to be doing. What they often need to be doing is eating much more nutrient dense foods, much less processed foods, much less palatable foods. They need to be eating 3 or 4 meals a day and not just grazing all the time. But these things don't feel very natural to them, and it's not because that way of eating is the best way of eating. It's just because it's become a habit for them. And then with that, when you have consumed thousands of calories a day, more than you need for years or decades or your entire life, and you're carrying way more body fat than you need, a lot of other physiological processes get really out of whack. So your hunger and fullness signals get completely out of whack. You don't know what it feels like to be full. You don't know what it feels like to be hungry. Your blood glucose levels are all over the shop. The way your body processes food, the way it digests food, the way it deals with everything is completely out of whack. And these then create a feedback loop. So, if your eating habits cause you then to have more cravings and have more hunger, then that feeds back into you eating too much all the time, and so on and so forth. It's just this feedback loop, and you kind of have to break that loop with external things, like understanding how much you actually need. And and when you do want to eat so much, it does involve some restriction. So in addition to what I was saying before about how our instincts are to eat too much and to eat more than we need and to eat as often as we can, and to eat as calorie dense food as we can, that's very natural. We also need to understand that our modern environment can make it easy to do nothing but that, and we do actually need to fight against that in some way and set ourselves up some rules and some standards to make sure that we don't just go eat like that. And also, because of the nature of the food that we have and the availability of the food that we have, those systems get really, really, really out of whack. And again, we need to like rein them in rather than just letting them, keep going unfettered. Reason number 5, and something that I found really, really, really unpalatable about the book, was just how much it's wrapped up in the very, very woke, very far left victimhood culture and this and the kind of oppression narrative. They talk at length. I mean, the first like half of the new edition of the book just talks about this victimhood narrative for like a couple of hours, and it was a really, really, really tiresome preamble to the book. And it's a really thick filter, because if you're somebody who believes in all of that stuff, then it's really signaling to a certain type of person who this book is for. And if you disagree with that mainstream narrative in any way, it feels really hard to listen to. So they talk at length about fat phobia and fat stigma and body positivity and haze that, I won't go into now. I have a lot of problems with all of those terms and a lot of the narrative that comes out around it, but it also goes into such length about race and gender and all these other kind of mechanisms of oppression that, for me, as somebody who just I've talked, on this podcast and on Instagram about how much I disagree with that narrative. It's very, very, very hard to get through. And I think it's all tied together. It's this kind of toxic compassion, this over compassion of like telling people what they want to hear, because sometimes facts can kind of hurt your feelings, and then building a narrative around that and putting short-term comfort in the way of long-term health and benefit and personal blossoming. So like in this narrative, it's very much about telling people that, you can be healthy at every size, that, terms like obese are wrong and bad, and that you can be healthy even if you're carrying way too much body fat, that everybody is beautiful, and so on and so forth, and that anybody who says otherwise, again setting up a false dichotomy, just has fat stigma, just hates fat people, and is just fat phobic. Again, big false dichotomy there. There's lots and lots and lots of in-betweens here. There's a lot of things where like two different things can be true at the same time. Like, for example, you can say, okay, it's important to keep your body fat percentage around a certain percentage, that there's a range that's healthy, that it's not healthy to be above a certain body fat percentage, but you can also not hate fat people and not and not oppress fat people and not judge fat people and be an asshole to them and just tell them like you need to lose weight and and shame them and whatever else. Two different things can be true at the same time, and this book is so wrapped up in those false narratives, those false dichotomies and those narratives that just put like, I don't want to offend anyone, so let's just tell them what they want to hear, even though that causes them to be unhealthy in the long run and reduces their well-being, reduces their mental health, reduces their physical health in the long run. Like, this is where it's important to be cruel, like to be cruel, to be kind, to sort of say, yes, I know that it's really difficult, like what you're facing, and I understand all the factors of why you've gotten to where you've got. But if you are above a certain body fat percentage, it is important to lose weight in order to be healthy, and also to feel and look good, right? Like, your body isn't going to work well when you are overweight. And so this is where it all ties in with the body positivity stuff for me, that like I did a whole podcast. I'll link in the description below my episode on body positivity and why I disagree with body positivity, so that you can have a listen to that if you find that interesting. Okay, so reason number 6 is that there's a really big focus on not under eating, but no guidance on what is enough and what is classified as overeating. So again, it's about extremes and there being a healthy middle ground. So there is such a thing as under eating and undernourishing your body, and that is not good. Eating too few calories, eating too few nutrients, that is not good. And it's something that I talk about a lot in my coaching and a lot online. A lot of people get themselves into trouble because they are in this under eating, overeating cycle. Under eating is no bueno, okay? But overeating, eating more than what your body needs, also is not good. And people need guidelines on what is too much as well as what is too little. You can't, what intuitive eating does is it sort of emphasizes over and over again that you must nourish your body, you must eat enough. It's kind of like this, it felt very much to me like my nan. Like, every time I go to my nan's house, she's just constantly worried that I'm not eating enough. Even if I have a huge meal and eat way too much food, she'll still be like, oh, well, you need to have this, and you need to have dessert, and you need to have breakfast, and you need to have she's always worried that I'm not eating enough. And intuitive eating feels very much like that. It's just this over concern of like, you not eating enough calories. And that 100% can be a problem. And overly restricting yourself, being very, very restrictive around food, not eating enough calories, being underweight, this is not good for you. But being overweight, eating too many calories also isn't. And intuitive eating gives absolutely no guidance on what is enough. And I think it does need to sort of also emphasize that eating too much food also is not good for you, also is not a good long-term strategy, and it's also something that you should try not to do. And it should give you some concrete guidelines around what that looks like what enough food is. And I think this is where calories come into things, where you can give people some really good solid guidelines around what is enough and what is too much. So a couple of ways I do that in my coaching is, one, by having actual calorie totals, understanding your maintenance calories, getting in a sensible calorie deficit, understanding how many calories are in different foods. The second way is by talking about flexible dieting and having an 80-20 approach to nutrition. So 80% of your food should be coming from nutrient dense foods and like whole foods. And the other 20% can come from junk. But it gives you a bit of a guideline of like, okay, well, if I need to eat 1,500 calories a day, then around 300 calories can come from junk, right? Because that's 20%. So you can give people some really concrete guidelines that obviously there's more to it than that, but it does give a starting point. It's not an end point, but it's a good starting point for what is roughly an acceptable amount for different people. And it takes individual differences into account as well. So coming to the end of my list, I'm going to talk about 3 more reasons why I don't like the intuitive eating approach. Reason number 7 is, I kind of touched on this before, but there's no focus on external factors. Everything is focused on your internal cues, like what you need, what your body wants, what your body knows. There's no focus on external stuff. So an example here would be calories, right? Understanding how many calories your body burns in a day, how many calories are in certain foods, how many calories you need to eat to lose weight or to lose body fat. These are really important things to understand. And again, intuitive eating sets up this false dichotomy that either you're counting calories or you're listening to your body. But my argument is that you can do both things at the same time. You don't have to override all your hunger and fullness cues to eat the right amount of calories. But you also don't have to listen exclusively to hunger and fullness cues. You can listen to both. And when you combine both and you understand where they intersect and where they meet, that's where you'll have really successful, you'll be really, really successful. So reason number 8 is a real focus on never feeling restricted. And one of the terms that's used quite a lot is unconditional permission to eat. And while I really do agree with the underlying principle here of like, you don't need to earn your food. You can, you don't need to, you're allowed to eat anything you want. One of the things they do talk about is like, don't have good and bad foods. Like, don't label foods good and bad. Like, don't think of yourself as bad if you've eaten some chocolate cake and good if you've not eaten very many calories today, right? I really agree with that kind of dichotomous thinking, but the way they present it is they set up more dichotomous thinking, because the uncomfortable truth is that if you want to lose fat, you cannot just eat whatever you want whenever you want. You do have to reduce your actual calorie intake. And I see a lot of women I've worked with lots and lots of women who've come into my coaching program, and these messages from intuitive eating are just so deeply ingrained in them that the word restricted comes up a lot. Like, they never want to feel restricted ever. But the difficult truth about, and the inconvenient truth, and something that is sometimes a little bit controversial to say, is that if you want to lose body fat, you are sometimes going to have to say no to things that you would like to eat. You are sometimes going to feel a little bit restricted, and that is not always a bad thing. That sometimes feeling a bit restricted and not getting to have what you want, that isn't the end of the world, right? Some people are so focused. I see this in my coaching time and time again, where people are like, I don't want to feel restricted. I want to be able to eat whatever I want. I don't want any sort of, and it's just not feasible. Like, when I say like that you are sometimes going to be restricted, I don't mean that you sometimes have to just deal with hunger and just live with hunger and just be hungry and not eat. That's not what I mean. But sometimes you might have a craving for something, and you might have to say, no, you know what? This doesn't line up with my long-term goals. I've already had some fun food today. I can't fit this in and still be on track. I've got an event coming up tomorrow where I want to have some fun food, so I probably shouldn't do that also today. Like, sometimes those things are going to happen. Again, you shouldn't be hungry while dieting, but if you are used to eating whatever you want whenever you want, you may sometimes need to restrict yourself. And I think this over focus on never feeling restricted gets people into trouble. And just one final thing, reason number 9, is they make this comparison between shoe size and your clothes size. So they say, if you are like, a size 10, you wouldn't expect to fit into shoes that are made for size 8 or 7. And so, if you're a certain clothes size, you shouldn't expect to ever fit as, like, you need to accept your body as it is. And I disagree profoundly with this comparison, because your clothes size is not the same as shoe size. It's not the same as height, right? No matter how much you weigh, like your weight and your body fat percentage is very, very, very elastic, right? Any individual could be, say, take a woman, she could be anything from like, she could be 20% body fat, she could be 30% body fat, she could be 40, 50, 60% body fat, right? We have an ability to store adipose tissue in a way that we don't have an ability to increase the size of our feet or decrease the size of our feet. We don't have the ability to grow a few inches and get taller, and we don't have the ability to get shorter through any sort of dietary interventions. But we do have an ability to influence the adipose tissue that we have stored on our body. So if you are currently 50% body fat and you're more in the morbidly obese category, and you're like size, I don't know what size that would be, like size 20 or something, you can lose body fat. You can go on a diet. You can go on a sensible diet that takes a lot of different things into account, and you can, through calorie restriction, you can use the excess adipose tissue that you have stored in order to make up the deficit, the energy deficit, and you can lose body fat over a period of time, and you will become a smaller and smaller and smaller dress size, and you might be able to become size 16, size 14, size 10, whatever. And likewise, if you are a size 10 or 12, if you're 20% or 25% body fat, if you're quite lean and quite slim, you can eat more calories than you need, and you can store those excess calories as adipose tissue. Okay, we have that elasticity when it comes to adipose tissue storage that we don't have when it comes to shoe size and height. So this is just a false comparison, and it's very, very, very disingenuous. I don't think they actually believe that your dress size and your body size is as constant and as uninfluenceable as your shoe size. Like, they cannot believe this. So I just think it's very, very disingenuous that they sell this as like, you know, they say this is the case, because it's clearly not. Anyone with half a brain knows that these two things are not the same. Okay, so I've talked at length about why I think intuitive eating is crap. I don't think it is good for fat loss at all. I think that some people experience fat loss with it because they end up eating fewer calories when they adhere to the principles, but they are the exception, they are not the rule. But let's talk about what I think the solution is instead. What you should do instead of intuitive eating in order to lose fat loss. Now, again, you know, there might be things, if your goal is purely just to improve your relationship with food and fat loss is not on the agenda, then there are parts of intuitive eating that I think are actually very, very helpful. There are parts of it that I think are really unhelpful as well, but there are parts of it that you may find very, very helpful. But if your goal is fat loss, intuitive eating probably won't work for you. And here's what I think you should do instead. And this is something that I've come to call intentional eating. And it's basically a combination of three things. So one element of this is listening to your hunger and fullness cues, right? Listening to how hungry you are, eating when you are. This involves a lot of things. There's a lot of things that go into this, but ultimately listening to your hunger and fullness cues. So one thing I'd say to a lot of my clients is to eat when you are a 6 or a 7 out of 10. Don't wait until you're a 10 out of 10, because then you just make bad decisions, right? You don't get extra points for being extra hungry. Stopping when you're 80% full, not eating. There's an expression that I love, like, the meal isn't over when I'm full, it's over when I hate myself. And I use that, I say that to clients a lot just to joke about, like, you know, just as a reminder, like a comic reminder of like when to stop. Like, don't keep going until the point where you like absolutely feel stuffed and bloated and disgusting. Like, listen to those cues. So on the one hand, you do need to listen to those internal cues, and there's a lot of other internal cues that you need to learn to listen to as well. But you also, the second thing that you need to be paying attention to is external objective facts about food. And when I work with clients, I work a lot with calories. I work a lot on counting and tracking calories, on understanding your maintenance calories, on understanding what kind of deficit you can sustain and feel good at and have a little bit of wiggle room with. But ultimately, CICO, calories in, calories out. And this is kind of external to how you're feeling. But you get much better results when you combine the two, when you're also paying attention to how foods make you feel, how full, how hungry you are, and you're paying attention to calories in, calories out, and those cold, hard facts about food. It's better when you do both rather than one or the other. And the third part of this equation is eating filling foods. Okay, understanding that some foods give you more fullness per 100 calories than others. So if you prioritize those high volume foods, if you prioritize eating things like chicken and eggs and vegetables and fruits and legumes and foods that yogurt, right? Foods like that give you quite a lot of fullness. Bread, rice, right? These are all things that go into that category that make you very, very full per 100 calories versus very, very, very calorie dense foods like chips, like, all the junk food, chocolate, ice cream. These, if you eat 500 calories of ice cream, you're not going to be full. If you eat 500 calories of chicken and rice and vegetables and some oil, you are going to feel very, very, very full. So you have to focus. There has to be a focus on eating filling foods as much as possible. Okay. And actually a final factor that I would take into account is also, nutrition, getting nutrient dense foods 80% of the time. Again, I prescribe to flexible dieting where 20% of the foods that you eat can just come from junk. But 80% need to come from from nutrient dense whole foods. So there's kind of actually like 4 factors in there. And I call this intentional eating, like just to give it like a banner, title. It involves 4 things: calories in, calories out, external facts about foods. 2, how you feel, how foods make you feel, how full and hungry you are. 3, on filling foods, and 4, on getting 80% of your foods from nutrient dense foods and the other 20% from junk, right? If you're eating 100% junk, like the Twinkie diet, you're going to, even if you do manage to lose weight, you're probably going to be hungry and miserable, and you're going to be unhealthy. So all 4 of these things matter, and it's better when you combine all 4 of those things rather than just focusing on one of them. So that's my solution and what I think you should do instead of intuitive eating. Let me know if you found that helpful. Let me know, as always, if you disagree. I love to discuss these things with people. It really helps me sharpen my opinions on these matters. And also let me know if you implement any of these strategies and have any success. I love hearing from people who do that and manage to lose weight just from, what I'm sharing through my podcast and Instagram. So thanks for listening.